We've been doing some research about the winter of 1962-63, the Big Freeze, which is something that is coming up almost immediately at our timeline.
It's just what I'm getting from this great documentary, The Big Freeze, that we linked in the last episode, and we're going to link it again in this epi's show notes. It may seem strange that a history podcast focusing on the Beatles would dwell so much on weather, but this was a once in 150 years occurrence where, actually, I think usually the Gulf Stream goes up the east coast of the United States, bounces off Cape Cod, and heads over to the UK and Ireland and Scandinavia and Western Europe. And that's why their winters are milder than, say, Maine or Boston, right? But this time, they were getting not just a Siberian anticyclone, but a Greenland anticyclone also at the same time. So like Arctic places, two Arctic places converging. And it was like Arctic almost continuously for 3 months.
Yeah.
All the while, the Beatles would go into the winter, still just a local Northwest band, and they would come out as a big deal nationwide. Their second single, Please Please Me, hits number 1 or number 2, depending on the chart, right in the middle of the freeze.
Ding, ding, ding. I'm just going to interject here.
Oh.
In my annoying role as the archivist.
Go.
To say that as far as historical records are concerned of the official UK singles chart, Please Please Me was officially number 2. It was number 1 on 2 charts and then number 2 on the others. And when it was averaged out, it was only number 2. So there, ha.
Each of our podcast episodes comes with a links list that's almost as interesting as the episode itself. In the current episode notes, please be sure to click or tap on The Big Freeze. It's a documentary. Yeah. You really don't want to miss it. The documentary makes the case that British culture was transformed that winter, 1962 to 63. Most of it's in 63. The 3-month Siberia meets Greenland weather period was like a cocoon from which a caterpillar metamorphizes into a butterfly, as if the Big Freeze and the post-war world before it was all in black and white. And then in March, the countries of Britain thaw out, and suddenly everything is in color, like in The Wizard of Oz.
Oh, yes.
Green. In understanding the British cultural context of 1963 after the Big Freeze, we see the actual downfall of the establishment with the Profumo scandal and the end of the Macmillan government. Television likewise goes anti-establishment with David Frost's TW3. This is what I've said at the beginning of the show. I'm just repeating it now.
Yes. Right.
Now there are independent television networks, Radio Luxembourg, influencing what will become pirate radio a year later. Women following fashion leaders like Mary Quant and Vidal Sassoon start wearing shorter skirts and mod hairstyles. And somewhere between the fashions, the sex scandal, the pill, and the Rolling Stones, the documentary sees British culture transformed. Of course, they're not making any causal inference that the Arctic weather changed the national culture. That'd be ridiculous. The timing is a coincidence.
Yes.
But we mention it because it makes the unfolding of 1963 next year easier to place in time. It helps us remember that mid-1963 is when Britain really becomes groovy. Oh, groovy, baby.
Groovy.
In this period next spring, it's like we're seeing class mingling, creating this high-low mod culture. The most eccentric, most debauched members of the establishment find ways to access a clever and classless and free London underworld.
Kind of reminds me of like Brian Epstein meeting the Beatles.
Absolutely. I want to ask Leslie Cavendish, Beatle friend and hairstylist, about this new mod period starting around 1963. Long before meeting McCartney, Cavendish started out working for Vidal Sassoon. I'm reading his book currently, meaning Leslie Cavendish. We'll link to it in the show notes. Early next year, he'll likely guest on Beatles 60 Live.
Oh, that's great. I cannot wait to talk to him.
There's also a new book called Beatles 1963 or something like that.
Yeah, I have it on order. It's hopefully going to be here in a couple of days.
Excellent. So more about that coming. You look at our group and page online or on Andy's blog or my blog or you'll find it.
Yes.
But we'll be talking about it in the next podcast.
Yeah.
I can't even pronounce the author's name. It must be Welsh or something.
I think it might be, yeah. Well, we'll make sure we've got that though too. But for now, we'll be right back.
So I just note the timing and the context of what folks experienced 60 years ago, just as young America was becoming bland and directionless. Maybe that's an unfair description, but kind of. England was starting to define the 60s, seemingly overnight. Now, Rob Gertzen is a real historian, and as such, finds the need to identify what caused what. He notes, the reason why that happened overnight, this is a quote, is because leading class was losing its credibility. He typed this really quickly to me. That's why the syntax is odd. As the empire was dissolving and consumerism gave young people the freedom to go forward, and then there's technology, radio, and sound, audio improving rapidly, with big companies behind consumer technological advancements that were generated during the war.
Yeah. And, on the Beatles 60 Facebook page, our friend Jerry Murphy had an interesting thing to say about the period right before that is worth noting. He said, I love his wording. If you're looking for cool amongst the so-called ruling classes in 1960 to 62, you'll be looking forever. The watchwords for them were establishment, private education, inheritance, received pronunciation, toffee nose taste, and class contempt. Wow. We need to bring Cherry back on.
Absolutely, because he would say that all scousy,
Yeah.
You'll be looking forever. But some of those who were born to rule at the time, who go to Eton and then to Oxbridge or whatever, Oxford or Cambridge or whatever, they start to satirize the establishment. Tim Summer, friend of the pod, notes that in the years immediately before the Beatles, the four young writer-actors of Beyond the Fringe and their rebellious but accessible satire took the West End and later Broadway by storm. Tim's not implying that the Beatles were modeled on Beyond the Fringe, but being satirically anti-establishment, yet sociable enough not to alarm the establishment was really a thing already out there in the culture. I mean, the Beatles, at the end of next year, we'll see that the press embraces them as cute, but they're like a Trojan horse. You know, they're behind the cuteness is this satirical, anti-establishment, countercultural, whatever. Being satirically anti-establishment, yet sociable enough not to alarm the establishment, was a thing already out there in the culture.
The Goons, among others.
What I'm noticing while doing this 60 years ago thing is that for Britain to change so dramatically that we're seeing in the early 60s that it seemed to require at least a few brave establishment types, otherwise respectable people, so-called, to descend culturally in order to shake things up. Beyond the fringe were no yobos.
No.
They were Oxbridge boys challenging the establishment from within. The mingling of the classes was essential to lead the initial change. The middle-class Rolling Stones had to quit college and embrace Delta Chicago blues. In the Profumo scandal, socialite Stephen Ward, the high society London osteopath at the center of the scandal, he was eager to befriend working-class girls, beautiful working-class girls. Epstein had to descend into the cavern, as you say, Andy.
Yes.
Britain's cultural rebirth seems to have required, at least in the early years, had required privileged class traders to make the first moves. I mean, the somewhat deviant, the restless among the upper class, as early as the post-Churchill mid-50s, but now at an accelerated pace with so many more leading the way and crossing class barriers around 1960 to 1963. Rob Gertson explained to me that the seeds for this change had been set long before this, even before the war. He notes, the mingling of the classes is a result of democracy, economic power, political emancipation of the workers during the first half of the 20th century, consumerism, the American cultural invasion. But, you know, I'm kind of glad not to be a professional historian. I mean, man, oh man, it's beyond the Beatles 60s scope to go back 100 years. That'll be Beatles 100, you know? I don't know, I have a whole life apart from this. But suffice it to say, this massive cultural shift coincided with the weakening of the establishment, and it happened to happen after the Big Freeze. There's a part about the Beatles in the Big Freeze documentary. It's brief but worth viewing. They were similarly going through a metamorphosis from national newcomers to Britain's big thing.
Yeah, you know, Love Me Do and Please Please Me had put them on the map. By late spring, they had their first consensus #1 song on the UK singles chart, For Me to You. UK Beatlemania was on its way.
And they all lived happily ever after.
Such a nice story. Some pretty heady stuff, actually. And I must admit that I had not really thought about it in that way so much before. So this is a really interesting thing to look at.
All of this is stuff that I'm learning from British people, basically.
Yeah,
I'm learning from research and a lot of YouTubing. YouTube can be very instructive, and Wikipedia. Yes. I really like those apps, actually. I'm not ashamed to say. But the rise of the Beatles and this unfolding of 60s culture in Britain coincided, but it's hard to say that one caused the other, except to note that Beatlemania couldn't have happened in the earlier, drier, unsexy, totally establishment-led Britain.
Well, you know how I'd look at it. I'm getting a reputation here, right?
Puzzle.
The national mood, the class mingling, these changes that start form the context of 1963. All a necessary puzzle piece. Or maybe multiple necessary puzzle pieces. So.
This is Beatles 60.
This was only part of a longer audio podcast. You can find one or two other parts of this episode on our YouTube channel. We post audio to YouTube only in short segments to make them easy to share. If your purpose is to share short segments of our audio podcast, then the YouTube clips can be convenient, but our YouTube channel is just for segments. It's audio, so there's nothing to look at. We're not really interested in producing video content. So, for Beatles 60, to tell you the truth, the YouTube channel is really where the action isn't. If you want a continuous listening experience for yourself while washing up or while hiking or while commuting, similar to listening to audiobooks, then we recommend getting our full podcast episodes automatically sent to your phone or your tablet or your PC every month. Use a podcast app. It's easy to find us and subscribe. There's a link in the show notes, or you can always go to Beatles60.group. You see, you navigate down to one of the episode pictures on the front page, and then you tap that, and then there's a description of the episode, and then listen now, and then you tap that, and you can choose any podcast app that works for you. Or you could listen right there if you want to.
This is Beatles 60.
The interval between this podcast and our next podcast will, 60 years ago, have been the exact same interval.
Get the idea? The Beatles will have experienced the exact same number of days, same season. All of you who have been following this real-time chronicle with us already get the pace.
You already understand, right? Same speed. Technically, we'd call this a longitudinal phenomenological historiographic study.
Larry.
Eh?
What's with all the academic jargon?
Well, this is a serious series. The Earth turns at one speed and in one way, am I right? At least in lived experience, last I looked. Now remember, the future is unwritten.
Ultimately, we're talking about human experience. We can't walk in the Beatles' boots if we're jumping around all different billions and billions of years, as nothing would make any sense.
So come on, we gotta repeat that slogan. This is a chronicle. Chronicle.
Beatles 60.
We ain't jumping around.